Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ancient Warfare Answers. It's me, Murray, on my own again, answering a question of yours for the Ancient Warfare Answers series. So here we go. You, of course, can ask a question. You just have to send us an email, a postcard, a letter, a message, telegram, however you like. You can get hold of us on Facebook, on Twitter, on various social media, and of course you can back us on Patreon, one of three levels, even get a copy of the magazine digitally or in print. This question is from Mason. We've answered a couple of his questions before. If Romans were fighting and happened to get surrounded, did they have a formation for that? Did the back line and sides turn around and form a square? Not a full legion, of course, implying this is on a relatively small scale. So the answer is yes, they did indeed have a formation for that. But it's also much less doctrinal. You remember an answer I had before about orthopraxy and orthodoxy. So there's not necessarily a doctrine for what to do when you get surrounded in Roman warfare. But there is some practicalities of what you should do. We find accounts of a marching column being attacked from both sides, and therefore by cohorts, the one cohort would turn and face to the right, and the one behind that would then turn and face to the left. So they would cover one another, but not necessarily half of a single cohort would form a, they wouldn't face opposite directions. We do have accounts of marching where the troops are getting shot at by the enemy from the right, meaning, of course, that the shields of the men marching was on the left. And, shockingly, the decision is to command the men to swap their shields to the right side, which is kind of logical, but at the same time, it's also a discipline thing because that would need to be ordered rather than just being the initiative of the soldier involved to swap his shield to his right side. So it's kind of interesting in that regard. But a very simple solution to being attacked from the right. And we do, of course, have a controversial, I wrote an article about it in Ancient Warfare magazine, about the Dexio Laboi of the Acts of the Apostles, where we have this word Dexio Laboi, which literally means right carrying. But I think it actually means left-handed spearmen, which is the opposite of what the word means, because I think it means that they carried their shield in their right hand, meaning right carrying. And the reason for that, of course, is that as they escorting Paul from Caesarea, they're worried that he's going to be ambushed by a bunch of zealots who have said that they're going to kill him. And so the troops are marched with 200 legionaries, 200 Dexio Laboi, and 70 cavalry. And so I think that the 200 legionaries are marching on the left, so their shields will be on the left. The 200 Dexio Laboi marching on the right with their shields on the right, and the 70 cavalry in front and behind. And that protects Paul from any attack, which doesn't eventuate. So that in that regard, you've sort of got these men who would be able to carry their shield on their right side, in terms of the number of left-handers in a legion, which of course is something that's really interesting in itself, because the population, the left-handedness of populations tends to vary between 12 and 18%, and that's still true today. Even though, there have been times in the past where anyone who was left-handed, and apologies to all of those of you who are left-handed who suffered it, have been forced to become right-handed. And of course, the interesting thing about that is no matter how much you're forced to become right-handed, you can always revert to left-handed very simply. So left-handedness in terms of the size of the garrison of Caesarea at the time, 1,500 legionaries, 200 men, gaps up right. So that's interesting. So that would be the left-handedness. So hence my argument that they're carrying their shield on the right. So there's that. There's also the idea, of course, that you have the testudo, but the testudo is interesting, and the only accounts we have of the testudo being formed are defensive rather than and almost last resort defensive, and to sort of hold out rather than attack. Now, again, interestingly, on Trajan's column and Marcus Aurelius's column, the testudo isn't shown in a defensive infantry formation, it's shown in a assaulting a city wall situation, which none of our literary accounts give us. So it's interesting that both those columns show the testudo attacking a wall or a walled city, and none of our literary accounts talk about that. We do get, close order, but it seems in the sources that close order and testudo are different. So in most cases, what you've got, therefore, is if you're surrounded, the unit forms into close order. We're not told specifically that they are forming square, and that if they had the opportunity to, you find that there are ranks or lines of legionaries rather than a square, and that normally the flanks are protected by auxiliary troops and light armed troops and other types of troop terrain, things like that. So the idea that you would turn units into, onto the flanks with their shields facing that flank is not given in our sources specifically, but it makes a lot of sense that they would do that. There's also issues in terms of, for instance, at the Battle of Gaugamela, what you find with Alexander is one of the accounts, I think it's Plutarch, talks about pulling the wings back to prevent them being surrounded. So it's like a giant U shape as they advance. And we do have others, the Battle of Adrianople, the Battle of Carrhae, where you find that there's this formation which seems to be like a square, and we do, have accounts of marching in squares, but obviously even in that square formation, there's going to be a flank somewhere which is vulnerable to enemy fire. It's not like a Napoleonic British infantry square where their bayonets are pointing out at all angles. At some point in your square, there's going to be someone whose right side is vulnerable because they're, holding their shields on their left or on their front. So that's interesting in the sense that we do get squares. The Battle of Carrhae, for instance, and even Antony, I think, when he's retreating from Parthia in the 30s BC, and some later formations, Josephus, I think, describes marching in a square. So that whole idea is, of course, that there's a unit somewhere that can cover you, like at Carrhae, for instance. The cavalry is meant to be inside the square and charge out from the square, which implies that there's got to be a gap, right? And of course, they might charge off foolishly and get slaughtered. But that sort of formation seems to work. And the interesting thing about Carrhae, of course, is that the inexhaustible archery of the Parthians seems to wear it down, and so has to sort of sue for peace and hence slaughter. So there's all sorts of interesting possibilities for what happens when you're surrounded, but they're not necessarily specified in the sources, which again is one of those issues of, are we not being told what were these things understood by the reader who understood what was happening and we just don't get it? Or are they slightly different in the sense that we're missing something, or was it not something that happened really? So it's very tricky to work out exactly what you're getting in terms of what was the way that the units actually dealt with this sort of situation. My example at the beginning, however, that it needed to be ordered is part of the Roman discipline, in the sense that whatever you're going to do under fire, you're going to need to have been ordered to do it. You can't just decide to do it. That would be breaking discipline and things like that. So that kind of intuitive ingenuity in showing initiative on an individual level isn't really what we get in Roman accounts. We do occasionally get the story of a legion being surrounded and in fact someone running interference and charging in, sacrificing themselves so that the legion could withdraw. So there does seem to be withdrawing. Just thinking about some of the battles with the Goths, there's an enormous testudo formed in 376 Marcianople, and they withhold, not withhold. What's the word, Murray? Withstand. They withstand the German attacks. And then, of course, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Goth forces surround them, and they are cut down. So we're not told there, for instance, that the back units turn around and face out. We're told that the units crowd together to try and get, the defense of the formation. So, and that's the criticism there is a lack of leadership, but it's also a problem in the sense that the flanks have been compromised. The cavalry's been driven off. And so that idea that you would turn around and stand like a British infantry square is a false one. That's not how things work. Same at the Battle of Cannae, for instance. We don't get that account of when the Roman legions march into Hannibal's trap, that they turn about to face wherever the threat was coming from, which we would sit there and say, well, that's logical. Of course you do that. That's not necessarily the way that the Roman military mind worked. Again, one of the issues with that, of course, is that if you're moving forward, you're winning. And so even though the Battle of Cannae is a Carthaginian trap, whereby it plays on that. If you're moving forward, you're winning. In fact, you're losing because you're marching into the trap I've built for you. So there's all sorts of fascinating things going there. So getting back to the question, and I think I might have digressed again. Gosh, sorry. They didn't have a tactic in terms of did the back line sides turn around and form a square. No, they seem to have turned about by unit when the case happened. They could have formed a square, but not a full square in the sense of a Napoleonic one. And otherwise, you stuck with what you were trained to do, which was to face front, moving forward and fight, even if that led to your ultimate demise. So I hope I've answered that question. We'll see you again next time. Thanks very much. Bye.